Right. Good morning or hello, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are and when you're starting to watch this video. Um, Today I am talking about education, modern education, and this is a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for some time now. If you've been following any of my Instagram posts, you know that I've been covering a few stereotypes that need to sort of be myth busted. And so I decided to create this video on this is the real problem with modern education. This is probably not going to be the only video that I do for this topic because it's so complicated, complex for so many people, and there's so many nuances that really need to get talked over. And one of the biggest problems that I see is that people try to reduce the issue with, all of education is the problem, when in reality, it's not all of education, it's, specific parts of modern education that need to really get like flushed out. So, without much ado, I'm going to get started. I'm just going to go ahead and move the page. So, I am going to follow a little bit in Ken Robinson's steps or footsteps with this sort of like discussion about modern education and why there is a crisis right now. Um, Ken Robinson, who we all dearly miss, was the author of Finding Your Element. And I don't want to, oversimplify the many wonderful things he points out in Finding Your Element. But one of the things that he does highlight is that, modern education is having a crisis because there's no passion instilled in students. There's no passion about, particular subjects, that passion is basically taught out of students by the time they're like in third or fourth grade. And that equates to lack of motivation, lack of desire to continue their education, to participate, to learn, to even have an open mindset, which is one of Carol Dweck's propositions in her work and writing. And I'm following up with Ken Robinson's um, sort of idea that passion is taught out of students by the time they're in like third grade. And I'm really trying to add some nuance because it's been some time since he passed away. And on top of that, I am Latina. I come from a BIPOC background. And so I tend to, and I'm also American. And so I tend to look at the issue from different perspectives. Um, in my sort of educational career, I've had the privilege and, to some extent, I guess the curse of having to work or being able to work it at different grade levels. Community college, university. I've also worked with, in K through 12 students, not just in, one county, but in a few different counties in Southern California. And I've worked with a wide range of student demographics from very, very young to much older. And one of the biggest issues right now is that, K through 12 is having a crisis. And a lot of people want to like blame the crisis on finance, like issues, money, and lack of funding, which is a problem. However, I think the problem goes much deeper than that. And also, we need to cover a lot of history to realize where this problem is really coming from. And the financial issues, in my opinion, are only a symptom of um, basically the overextended nature of the education system as it is right now. The education system, especially from like districts that are extremely large, and also districts that are extremely large and trying to serve demographics that have primarily been underrepresented students or that carry a lot of generational trauma from either racism or slavery or other types of um, systemic issues that in society that carry on generationally are showing up in the K through 12 classroom because these students come from families that are basically still struggling with the legacy of so many other different societal issues, right? Like I said, racism, slavery, migration issues, you name it. And not only that, but the way that we understand education has changed a lot with democracy. So, democracy has really made education a right, right? We're all entitled to basic education. However, that wasn't so when education, in the way that we see it in the classroom, started back in the classical times. Back in classical times, the education that was being promoted as democratic, as a right to every human being, was actually the Socratic seminar in which you kind of read books, you sat down, you discussed ideas, you developed your critical thinking skills, and you learned how to be a good orator. You learned how to persuade people properly. You learned how to argue a point. And to a certain extent, um, you learned like other basic things about life that, would help you become a good citizen. And that idea has changed so much since classical times, and the way that it's been like overextended because of this ideal of American democracy has really had, such a huge impact on basically society as we know it now. And it just doesn't translate the same way that it was originally meant to be, um, as it originally was meant to work back in classical times to the current model classroom structure. We've standardized a lot of that teaching in so many different ways. And so, you know, on top of the overextension, the type of demographics of students that we're trying to teach, and on top of the changes that democracy itself has created, um, in trying to standardize teaching to make it easier to teach all these different types of individual students, has really put a lot of pressure in the current K through 12 educational system. And, you know, in order to kind of combat some of these issues, there have been so many professionals that have tried to target how to address education in a way that basically addresses systemic social inequality and racial and financial inequalities that are generational due to colonialization, racism, you name it. And we first started with the idea of like equality, which is where this sort of notion of like no child left behind was born into. And that really meant that, you treat every child equally and you do your best to get them to graduate and have the minimum like education. However, that also meant this idea that you treat every child the same way ended up having problems because um, we realized that really wasn't the best strategy. That sometimes you do need to treat the, Black student or the Latino student differently because they come from a family that has had generational struggle. So you cannot treat them the same as you would a white child who comes from a privileged background. And, this idea of like equality does not apply the same in the classroom, and it should not. And it, a lot of advocates have said, you should not also apply this in the legal juvenile criminal system way either, right? You need to also apply this idea of like equity. And what equity is acknowledging that certain demographics of students require a different approach, require different types of methodologies, require an adjustment in thinking, and require an adjustment in standards. So back in the days, and I can say this from personal experience, a lot of times students were not given or not approved for, say, like, or admitted to colleges or universities because they didn't have exposure to certain topics. However, because of equity, you would acknowledge this person didn't have the opportunity to have exposure to these topics or subjects, but because, there are other ways of like assessing the student, because of equity, we're able to determine that the student has the ability, the critical thinking ability, the intelligence, the motivation, the desire to learn, the open-mindedness to learn. If they were to be exposed to those same subjects or topics, then they would actually perform as expected, right? In an excellent or successful way, or whatever their standards are. And the K through 12 crisis has resulted in like a variety of different results right now with students, because of this, because people confused equality with the best strategy, and it ended up not producing the best results. And then on top of it, we have like political and social crises that are affecting everyday classroom. And so what we have is like the fear that right now we have a lowering of standards. The biggest example and the best example right now that I have to give you is the COVID crisis and how we all went to lockdown and were forced to do teaching through Zoom. And what we're realizing now is that the students that were forced into quarantine and were not giving appropriate time to like recover are actually performing at a lower grade level. So essentially, even though they were moving forward in grades, they actually were not at that same grade level. And so really, if they're graduating, 12th grade, it meant that actually they would probably need to do some bridge work in order to actually be at that 12th grade level. So there's a huge concern that this is actually really what has been affecting the K through 12 crisis for much, much longer. But COVID just literally highlighted it to a lot of people and put the education system, what's going on, under a microscope. So we were able to see it with much more clarity. And as an instructor, I can personally say that it put a lot of pressure and stress on a lot of instructors, especially with this idea of remote teaching and remote learning. The classroom was taken to a very intimate, space, which is the home, and it blurred a lot of boundaries that professors and instructors were not very, I think personally, were not prepared to handle. And for on many levels, socially, professionally, but also legally, it like opened the floodgates to a lot of like nuanced situations that administration was not prepared to confront. I can say this with a certainty that, there were a lot of instructors very concerned about the legalities of being alone online, one-on-one with students, and there was no safety net um, around them to like make sure things were appropriate. The appropriate things were going on in those meetings. And so they were requiring, educational aides or assistants to be present at all times. At the other end of the spectrum, it became really obvious that a lot of students were struggling severely with being able to eat every single day, being able to have access to internet, being able to have access to a computer or an iPad or a phone. The need for a phone became, a critical point of conversation, because prior to this, K through 12 was very adamant that we should not allow the phone in the classroom. But it was the phone that saved a lot of, underprivileged students or underrepresented students from missing so much class time because they were on their phone, attending their classes on their phone. But even when they attended class, so they wouldn't be truant and get their parents into legal issues, that was not enough to help them, like, to meet the requirements of the class. A lot of them struggled with getting essays done. A lot of them struggled with reading materials. A lot of them struggled with accessing certain types of software because not everyone had the latest Apple cell phone. Um, and so these nuances became like exponentially highlighted to everyone. And, there was a lot of people that were extremely burnt out and incredibly depressed, especially when they really are incredibly passionate about education and they really believe in what they're doing. But these were things that a lot of advocates were pointing out were issues, decades prior, and it just became incredibly, um, like obvious to a lot of us in during the COVID crisis. And even now, we're still recovering, I think. Oops, I'm gonna jump ahead too much. Okay. So the, I bring this sort of example of COVID up because this idea that like students were not actually at grade level has been a huge concern for a really, really long time. And prior even to COVID, community colleges were already trying to find ways of getting students into college credit courses sooner so they wouldn't lose their financial aid money, and we're creating and advocating for ways of guaranteeing these students have their financial aid money or access to financial aid sooner, um, and to give them more time to like actually learn the skills that are required to help them pass college credit courses. So a lot of community colleges were creating things like bridge programs, which were addressing what I was talking about earlier, this idea that even though the student has, say, for example, the intelligence, the IQ, the motivation, the critical thinking skills, they might not have had exposure to certain, subjects or topics because of so many other reasons, so many other issues within K through 12 that were out of their control. And in order not to pass judgment on their ability to like move forward in their educational career, a lot of colleges and universities were creating bridge programs to like get them up to um, basically catch them up and get them up to score, with the requirements that would help them pass these college credit courses. And one of the laws that was passed before COVID was California AB 288, which is the one that sort of protects the college credit based funding and like supports bridge programs that help these students enroll in multiple of the same courses or similar courses to help them move forward and to help them access college credit courses faster. Um, and the brutal reality is that a lot of students, you know, before these bridge programs were enrolling in college credit courses and getting incredibly discouraged. And for a lot of them, it became a psychological struggle to realize that they were not up to par with like dealing with what was required in college credit courses. And so it became like a circular problem where they would not be able to keep up. Their self-esteem would, struggle. Their desire would tank. So they wouldn't want to continue and they would either drop out, not be able to pass the course, and they wouldn't want to try again. And they just like it reinforced this idea that education was just not for them. And in order to combat this, a lot of these college like bridge programs were created, and we passed this law to help students start learning the skills that were required at a different pace, either slower or giving them more time to catch up on like basic requirements. And I can tell you from personal experience, one of the biggest hurdles was not even actually learning the subject. It was study skills, it was motivational, it was psychology, like a lot of it was technology once again reared its head for a lot of students. They realized I don't even know how to send an email. Like, I don't know how to say what I want to say. I don't know how to make something and like highlight something on a word processing program. I don't know how to put something in bold. In English in particular, where I actually worked in a lot for in community college with students, a lot of the questions were not even English related. They were related to technological like issues. How do I format this? How do I format that? And it wasn't so much as like, what are the rules, the MLA rules, but literally, how do I change the margins on this word processing program? And that made it so clear for so many of us in education that the students needed foundational knowledge that was even not related to the subject that they were trying to learn, right? So that added a lot of, for me personally, added a lot of knowledge as to what was going on with this sort of like modern educational crisis and why so many of these students either give up, get bitter, or feel like it's being gatekept, right? Like there's some sort of like hidden conspiracy to not allow them to access education, when in reality, for those of us that like look at this critically because we work in the field, it's actually the problem for them wasn't that English is hard to learn. It's that they needed a perspective change on what the actual problem was. Um, Not only that, but to move on into a little bit of like breaking into some of those stereotypes on what the problem is. A lot of students, like I was just saying, feel like there's a lot of gatekeeping. And yes, there is. I'm not going to lie. There's a lot of gatekeeping for a lot of different reasons. Um, However, because of the nature of like the different types of universities being structured differently for different purposes, um, the idea of like hiring hierarchy in institution like has different faces to it. Um, the education system, different parts of it were created for different reasons. And this is what I have been sort of trying to highlight in a lot of my social media posts is that you need to be very intentional why you're going to school and what you're trying to learn and the reasons behind why certain educational programs or certifications are so valuable, right? So, in K through 12, you get your high school diploma, and that is like a foundational degree that's given to you or helped that the government helps you get, because it is foundational for like your social well-being and to be a citizen with somewhat equal footing as every other citizen. But the rest of education after that is a choice and slash a privilege that you can access. College is, well, for the most part, considered a transitional type of educational system. You generally can get AAs, certifications, education that will help you get permits. You can transfer from college, community college, once you get your AA to a university to get a bachelor's. Um, Community college can help you access vocational education. So a lot of vocational education programs, such as like how to be certain kinds of like a nursing assistant or how to like be a certain type of legal assistant, get a certain type of paralegal education, or access like dentist assistant programs, you name it. There's so many like different types of certifications that you can get at a community college level. But that is why we consider them like transitional type colleges, where this is some of the foundational work that you can do if you want to become a better qualified, more educated professional in that field, or you need a particular type of certification or permit, you use community college as like to transition to university. And university is again also has its own hierarchy within the university like system, but generally you can get like higher education that will help you become more qualified in a particular field. Um, and that means like instead of being just a nursing assistant, you can be like a certified RN if you go to university. And that's what we talk about hierarchy, right? So hierarchy within the particular career that you want to access, but also within the university and college systems themselves, there are types of hierarchies that you need to consider. So within university, you have something like, your state colleges or state universities like Cal State, um, California State University, and then you can access like different campuses, right? So I attended California State University, Dominguez Hills. But before that, I had attended University of California, Santa Barbara. So in terms of hierarchy, California State University would be a little bit below the University of California, which means that University of California is slightly more, privileged or like challenging or difficult, definitely harder to get into because the um, system has more requirements. And, to continue that example, the University of California, for example, or a state university would be probably a little bit below what you would say is like an Ivy League. What would we consider like Stanford or Harvard or a number of other Ivy League, universities. So when we talk about hierarchy within educational, like between educational institutions, that is what we're talking about. And that is why so many students get discouraged when, they can't access college credit courses and they feel like education is not for me. They it's probably because they don't have the bigger picture on how the network works, right? Um, that being said, something that I want to like myth bust here because I've worked at so many universities, like so many college settings. I've gone to different universities and I've worked at a lot of different educational systems. I want to do a little bit of like, I think like humility work here because even within the university systems, despite the fact that these universities are giving certifications, doctoral, master's, bachelor degrees to a very distinct set of individuals, small percentage of people in society, because the education system is so structured and because the demands for particular professions are so intense, a lot of the times these individuals still require further specialized education in order to be real like specialists and know pretty much everything there is to know about that field. What I'm trying to say is that even though they have a bachelor's degree from UC system, they don't know everything. The average doctor is not that intelligent. Um, and I'm saying this with full humility because I have been in classrooms at the UC system where there's a lot of curving of grades. The education is very standardized, and it's very brutal for so many students, even within those systems, because they get filtered out within one class, within the first couple of weeks, within the first couple of tests, because the requirements are so intense. And the average student grade gets carved up quite a lot in your average STEM classroom, regardless of whether you are black or white or brown or Asian or whatever. The average grade is somewhere around a C plus and gets curved up to an A, A minus, whatever it is, right? The person with the highest score usually sets the bar. And that is to, that is to illuminate um, the reality of how this works for so many people that have struggled with, self-esteem issues because they got rejected, or they failed a certain class, or they got rejected from a certain university. Um, Even with these degrees, this is the reason why so many doctors, for example, go into further specialization. This is why they require so much education to be a neuroscientist or neurosurgeon or whatever it is, to specialize in a particular legal field. This is why, even despite getting their GD, so many attorneys spend an additional year to qualify for to be able to work in a specific field, right? Because, of this reality that it's so intense and there's so much to learn that a lot of the really, like, the most professional and like most educated people in the world who are specialists and who are at the top of the top in their profession have been in school for something like 12, 14 years. And even then, uh, that person is highly educated, not because of how much education in the system they've had, but because they will acknowledge to you that they probably don't know everything and they should probably be consulting another professional. And that's usually my criteria for knowing when somebody knows something, is that they will say, I'm a specialist in this field, but I'm going to refer you for a secondary opinion because I think it's necessary. And the that kind of level of humility is something that you learn after, like, having incredibly good teachers and professors. And the problem is that um, a lot of the struggle and crisis in education right now is not just a low self-esteem, but at the other extreme end is like having a huge ego and, gatekeeping through that ego. Um, which leads me to the Ivy League. Also, another sort of research, like, skill-based training university system. There is like an incredible of amount of, like, you know um, news coverage as to what's going on with Trump and, like, the Ivy League system being uh, a target of the Trump administration right now, which I think to some degree is a result of, like, cultural racial bias that has been left to brew on these campuses without any checks and balances for a really, really long time. It just happens to be, based around Israel and Palestine at the moment. But I think this actually is something that, sadly, a lot of BIPOC students have been talking about as an issue at university, at so many different universities for a really, really long time. And this is an issue that actually mirrors a little bit of what is happening in publishing right now as well, when it comes to, like, diversity being weaponized. The Ivy League system, in my opinion, has used and weaponized diversity for two different reasons. A, to not appear racist. B, to get grants and funding through federal programs. But in reality, even though you change the veil on something, it doesn't mean that the actual system has changed. So we have a lot of individuals that graduated from these universities or attended that come out realizing that it was a huge cultural and racial battle for them to even graduate, and being able to have access to certain networks, even within an Ivy League school, became an entire battle the entire time they were there. Um, the other thing I want to highlight is sort of this idea of, like, why would you even want to attend a university or an Ivy League when a community college with, financial aid that you don't need to pay back would be the best, easiest, way of getting educated. Um, and one of the biggest things that I also hear what I hear behind this sort of like you don't really need education is I wouldn't invest hundreds of thousands of dollars for, a degree from Harvard, because it just doesn't seem worth it for me. They're not that opinion I've heard so many times, and that's what I hear when I hear sort of this, so like you don't need education, is that it's the cost, right? Like, why would you pay for Harvard when you can go to Cal State University? The reality is that they're not just paying for the types of education you can access, but they're paying for the different types of professors and the professor networks that you can access. You're also paying for a type of cultural access. So, and this is the hidden truth behind the idea that like it's not what you know, it's who you know. Yes, you should still be qualified in your field, and there's no excuse if you're not. But along with that, success often means having access through these universities and colleges to networks that will help you achieve your career or your professional goals. That is just the reality. You're not just paying for the types of books, the structure, you're paying for the access to these networks. You're paying for the name, right? It's the reason why you buy Gucci and not Target, right? And the best parents to talk to for me have always been the parents that, without me needing to tell them or, to instigate this conversation, will say, even if I have to spend the rest of my life paying for my kids to go to Stanford for a bachelor's degree, I will do so because I know that to be, for example, a Latina getting into Stanford after having come from a generation of like migrant workers who have been stuck working janitorial jobs or like construction or being mechanics without certifications, working on their table, whatever it is, that kind of access is like irreplaceable. There's very little financial, like, um, there is very little in this world that equates to that kind of access. Um, So that's just kind of like to put it in perspective for so many people, what this means culturally and racially for so many of us that are from underrepresented demographics to be able to have to access to these different types of educational institutions. That's really what it means. And in order to, even when the job market is difficult, um, that is, dealing with the uncertainty of getting hired as a Stanford graduate is still such a different privilege than, you know, um, struggling with getting hired with only a high school diploma. And so, hopefully that highlights kind of where a lot of us are coming from and why we kind of have a different perspective on this like modern educational crisis. And now that we're like on the topic of stereotypes, I don't want to make this video too long, but I do want to talk about stereotypes. I mentioned how the biggest source of where you know, the crisis arises from is essentially just stereotypes that have lingered in society culturally so much and have migrated and like been, not only that, but they've been exploited by so many different people also to instill fear in minorities so that they don't achieve greatness through educational access. They don't, aspire to success through educational access because that means access to a different type of network or social structure. And so these stereotypes, these myths really need to get busted and they need to get like um, pulled apart with a lot of nuance. Education is not a waste of time. Again, like I said, the biggest pleasure is talking to parents who, even though they didn't have access to formal education, have instilled that like how important it is to their own children, because that's a different type of education. Perhaps they were not in a position to get a high school diploma, but they were in a position to be educated on the importance of something. The other stereotype is like education is not needed to get far in life. I don't know how many times I've heard that like people just, you shouldn't, if that's the thought you're gonna say, don't say it. Just it's really dead and over with. Or the education is boring. Um, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of professors are a little bit boring. Um, uh, that's without, I guess, saying. But I don't think education is boring. When you're in generally and genuinely interested in something, the subject itself is going to be really fascinating. I think that the professors that are boring and make their subject boring is probably because A, they're depressed themselves, or they were pushed into that field without having genuine passion. And I see this a lot with medical doctors, and this is something I've talked about with a lot of my Asian students that I've had in the past, that a lot of, post 1990s, post 80s, a lot of the students that I've talked to that were from like Asian like heritage conveyed like the pressures to become doctors from their families and their parents. And a lot of them expressed boredom with what they do and just general disinterest and depression. And they realized then a lot of them had the courage to switch to other careers they were more passionate about, despite the like pressures of their family. Um, but a lot of them that actually just continued to do, you know, um, like to move in that direction of like, be a doctor, ended up realizing that they hate that job they do because, and they consider it really boring and just distasteful. And they really hate their life because they continue to be in a field that they don't like. And in reality, a lot of this is like adding nuance to where these stereotypes are coming from. Um, so yeah, like education, when you're really passionate about learning something, should never be boring. It should always be interesting. That is a key tenet of what Ken Robinson was saying, right? Like if you're genuinely passionate about something, it's going to be easier to learn and vice versa. Not only that, being passionate means that you're going to approach a problem in the field with an open mindset. So even having a problem in that field, discovering the solution to that should be interesting for you. Um, so that's one side of that. What else did I want to add? I wanted to say something else about what Ken Robinson was saying. Ken Robinson also highlights the importance of different types of learners. And I think this is going to be my transition into my next point, that learning should not be boring, because if it is boring, it's usually a symptom that the type of teaching or type of structure that you are in, or the type of systemic education that you've like tried to access is not for you, or the type of pedagogy is not for you. And this is the result of this is what he means by like, by the time they're in third grade or fourth grade, we teach the passion out of students is because we standardized teaching. The same, we, this is why a lot of advocates argue against like, you can't teach students in a cookie patterned type of way without getting like an industrial whiplash problem, right? So when you create like when you try to create a system to teach every student the same way, it's like trying to like create an automobile industrial process, like an under automobile construction or building industrial process. Like that's not going to work for humans because we're not a machine, right? Um, and so these types of like cookie pattern type of teaching structures do a lot of underprivileged, underrepresented students a disservice. And what we really needed to start learning about was learning about learning. Like learning about learning means like some students are kinesthetic learners, other students are visual learners, other students do better as audio learners. Other students are independent learners. They do great if they just follow one track of thought, one idea all the way through, and they follow their curiosity naturally. They're going to end up being exposed to so many other fields connected to that. So if they're interested in space, right, without a doubt, at some point they're also going to get culturally relevant knowledge about space or astronomy or astrology. They're going to get exposed to the types of math involved. They're going to get exposed to the history behind scientific discoveries. So they end up, as independent learners, basically learning everything they should have learned anyways. And so this is why we need to talk about what the problem or the crisis within modern education really is. It's that we're not talking about that learning about learning is a critical part. Um, and that like this idea really informs the way that like different educational degrees are awarded. Um, so there's a lot of like instructors that in community college that don't have a PhD, for example, because they're teaching how to do very technical skills at community college level. So maybe they have mostly like master's degrees, which is fine because you're learning how to do technical writing, like how to write a persuasive essay, how to write an explanatory essay or an explanatory paper, or whatever it is. You're learning how to do presentations. The type of qualification that your instructor has generally will inform what levels they're able to teach or substitute teach or whatever, like work in. And what's happening is that this educational crisis, unfortunately, because at MA level, even to this day, a lot of people that are teaching assistants, teaching aides, tutors, even professors don't necessarily get taught on pedagogy, on this idea of like learning about learning or learning about how to teach different types of learners. Um, what happens is that these same instructors create or exponentially make worse, right? The problem that students have when it comes to like low self-esteem or mental health issues related to like struggles within education. Essentially, like to give you an example of this, if a student goes to a tutor because they, um, are trying to write a personal essay, um, if the tutor isn't appropriately educated on being able to assess what that student's real problem is, they're not able to better help the student. More often than not, that a lot of tutors, for example, might not be educated on like psychologically responsive pedagogies, so they won't be able to to be able to help that student properly because that student's issue might not even be like a technical writing problem. It actually might be the fact that they are struggling to write about their some of the most traumatic issues in their life, which would actually help them write a better essay if they could access that. Um, and this is where, for example, I would recommend doing some like work with journaling because in order for a student to be able to have access to higher education or to transfer or to be able to have a chance to be admitted to certain types of universities or colleges on the basis of diversity, they need to be able to write about it. But if they get, help from a professor or an instructor that doesn't know how to help them through that and put it on paper, that student's probably not going to write a great personal statement or essay that really highlights why that university should be like taking them in the first place. And when it comes to like having the student fail repeatedly on getting admitted to certain colleges or universities, and I've spoken to them before, like, well, why haven't you gotten admitted to a good university with this kind of background or this kind of life story? They tell me, well, I wrote this personal essay on this and this. And I sit there and I go, did you go to the writing center? And they say things like, yeah, I did. And the tutor told me to write about this. And they told me that this is how I should write it. And I sit there and I realize, even within my field, even within like, a group of master's degree qualified individuals, those types of people might still be doing that student a disservice because they're not able to teach that student how to access, you know, the knowledge and the background and the basically their best qualities and how to put it in on display better so that they can have access to bigger opportunities. Um, so that's the difference between the type of qualifications of the very people working at these institutions. And this is also why now we have the issue where a lot of tenure track individuals in community college require a PhD. And so why a lot of individuals end up realizing that in order to even get hired and have an opportunity to work in community college, a master's degree is no longer enough. So they need to go to a research-based university because a research-based university will more likely expose them to these different types of pedagogies and pedagogical structures and like pedagogical approaches. That's a whole other different type of field within education. So just because somebody has an English degree, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually better qualified to teach somebody English, because that might require further types of education. And you can access this kind of qualification in different ways. You can go into like educational psychology research and do have an entire field trip and study the different types of research that's happening there. You can go into different types of teaching pedagogy or teaching philosophy. You can go and get a PhD in education, or you can get your like teaching credentials. A lot of these sort of like uh, qualifications overlap. Um, with that being said, like you can get a PhD in like educational psychology, but mind you, that's a different type of qualification versus saying I was in educational psychology uh, as a research field, because within educational psychology, we often use whatever's published as a source for like pedagogy or like developing a teaching philosophy. Um, and this is something crucial for like anybody who wants to become a type of professor or an instructor or who has a type of humanities degree that is trying to get into any kind of teaching. They need to understand that a lot of these fields overlap, right? And one of the I think crises within modern education was that a lot of people don't just get discouraged as students, but they get discouraged as instructors because they don't know what they need to know in order to be able to have access to these fields. And oftentimes, the degree itself is not enough. They need to actually start accessing the networks within them and start asking professionals what is required to know. And they're going to have to go and learn those skills separately because not all of this is like part of like a master's degree program, for example. That being said, the problem. What is the problem? Um, The huge, like the problem changes. It really changes from structure to structure, from like type of education to type of education. And this is probably one of the points where a lot of my former students, if they ever watch this, are going to be like, oh, there she goes again with her, it depends, right? Because it really does depend on, a holistic assessment of where the problem has been for the student, for the individual trying to access these different either careers or like educational tracks. Um, the problem really does depend because it could be the student doesn't have the educational background themselves, they haven't been exposed to something, or it could be psychological, it could be cultural, it could be that they're really just maybe not suited for a particular uh, field. They need to think about like their career differently. And overall, to go back to what Ken Robinson was saying, yeah, it could just be passion. We teach passion out of the student so they don't see the point and they literally close up. So you can't even have this kind of nuanced conversation with them anymore. Um, but I think it actually this sort of like lack of passion uh can be refined to a different idea that the problem is that they don't know what the point is. Like, what is the point? Somebody's teaching me in a cookie cutter way. What is the point of even graduating from high school? What is the point of even going to uh, community college? What is the point of even dreaming of any of like this? What's the point of dreaming that I'm going to be more than um just a housewife one day? Um, they don't know how to answer that question because they haven't been taught to answer that question. And to go back to that point of like, my dream is to be a housewife. Like, why should I even get educated? Like, why should I even graduate from high school? I would recommend that they read some of like Mary Wollstonecraft because she wrote a nice uh, kind of like philosophical feminist statement on this, right? The better educated the mother, the better educated your children will be. And when you kind of break those cycles of lack of education, you have more access to different types of wealth. So that is for the independent learners to look into. So, what is the crisis? I think it really boils down to the fact that these students never had that question answered. What is the point? What is the point is that you're miserable in where you are in life, and there are things that you can learn in order to not be so miserable. Even when you're unemployed, when you tap into that educational background, or when you tap into the types of like psychological education you've had in the past, you build resilience against certain types of problems. So, what is the crisis? The crisis is that, we don't know what's the point. We don't know why it's important, and we don't know why it's helpful, right? I talked about like the financial benefits of being able to have a certain type of education. There's a world of difference in the type of like financial well-being that you might have as a doctor versus as just a nurse, for example. Like, and I'm talking about like a nursing assistant with a very basic certificate. There is a type of like financial access to financial security when you're hired as a tenure track professor with a PhD versus being hired by a community college when you only have a master's degree. There's that difference, right? We don't talk about the social impact of being able to have access to different networks. That means potentially being able to move to better communities where your child is going to experience um, less maybe racism or whatever it is, right? And that really equates to other types of wealth. We're not talking about money wealth all the time. We're talking about like security when it comes to employment options and also when it comes to network well-being, right? Access to other types of benefits that make your life better. And overall, like the crisis is a my point of view is the crisis in education is a psychological crisis. There's a huge impact when you're able to realize that this is a problem. There's a huge difference when you realize that when you hack into that question of like what's the point and you're able to like, you know, cut that kind of thinking short. There is a huge mindset shift that changes when you're able to realize and you're able to help students realize that the problem is helping them become more confident, helping them achieve self-efficacy, which is part of like what we call in education and in pedagogy, like another word for confidence. In other words, when you have confidence in yourself, it really shows, even when you're unemployed, even when you perhaps are working in a field where you haven't had like awards or you haven't been rewarded with something or a thank you or whatever it is, like when you have confidence in what you do and you're able to solve certain kinds of problems, that really that's a huge like that changes and revolutionizes your life, in my opinion. Um, but this is what education does for people, being able to have that confidence in a particular field. Um, Self-efficacy is a huge part of like a good teacher or a good instructor's method of teaching is trying to get the student to learn this strategy method on their own without needing someone to hold their hand. It is the difference between the student that has a confidence of going to ask a tutor a question. It is a confidence, the difference in confidence of a student that realizes that maybe this tutor doesn't have all the answers. Maybe I should come back tomorrow and ask a different tutor. That's confidence. And a lot of students don't get as far as even thinking, maybe I should ask somebody about this problem that I'm having so that I can figure out a solution. That is self-efficacy. That is confidence. And, you know, the student that closes themselves up and says, what's the point, is the student that has this psychological problem, that has a mental block. That is the crisis. That is where we're um, really struggling as instructors, administrators who care at all different levels. And I say this because this is something that we saw happen during and after COVID dramatically with students. They pretty much gave up. And we're still trying to correct that, right? Because they're, no matter how behind somebody fell in their education, if they break into um, or break past this idea of what's the point, and they start realizing that the point is to become more confident and more like able to solve problems on their own, and that 95% of education is on the person that's trying to learn something, not on the educator. That really changes um the possibility that like the person's actually going to get their goals met. So I mean, hopefully this made some sense to people. I feel like when I'm talking, sometimes it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but and I and I'm probably going to have a bunch of other stuff to add to this conversation as time goes on. And I may have questions if you have questions, please leave comments. Um, because it could really depend on your particular situation. Um, so another part of like the modern educational crisis goes into something I was talking about earlier at the beginning, and why my particular experience is always nuanced, right? Because I'm Latina and I come from an underrepresented, underprivileged background. And my culture, my particular cultural and racial background has had a huge impact on me. When I've taught in LA, I've talked to so many students of different demographics, like Black, Latino, Asian students who reported very similar stories. And there's a really common thread that emerged that the other crisis, also psychological, was related to culture. So all of this, sorry about that noise, all of this becomes like a moot point if the person goes back home after graduating with a bachelor's or a master's and they encounter cultural issues that like really hit their self-esteem or make their like mental health problems worse. For a lot of students that were able to graduate and overcame like certain cultural structural problems within the educational systems themselves and then return home and have to confront a whole other different side of like cultural racial issues related to educational um like stereotypes, they're going to come across like very different, like a struggle of like within one person, a struggle of two different types of cultural problems, right? The problems at school confronting systemic racism, and then the stereotypes at home, that are perpetuated by individuals that don't believe that education is a way of opening doors for them. So this is a very particular type of struggle that I've seen for a lot of BIPOC students. They have stereotype busting burnout. They have to stereotype bust at school, and then they have to stereotype bust at home. And so it becomes like you go from one war to a different war, and that kind of psychological problem for BIPOC students, it's is so like underrated. It's not spoken about enough. And this is why so many Latinas and Latinos in higher education have a severe, like, have a really uniquely challenging time because they're actually fighting, you know, a certain kind of structure at school, but then they also go home and they struggle with like other types of cultural mental health issues. They have advocacy burnout. They're advocating for themselves at school or within their educational systems, but they also go, home and they struggle with advocating for themselves. They have to like always confront and defend why they went into higher education, why getting a master's degree is so important, why getting any kind of certificate is so important. And this is why talking to students who have parents that are, savvy in that way, that make this easier for their children is such a blessing, is such a pleasure, even for me as an educator, when the parent knows that what their student is aiming for is actually a great thing and is really supportive. That kind of support is just like a huge relief for so many BIPOC students on a psychological level. And it really lifts up a lot of the burden because advocacy burnout is a real, genuine thing. Um, Gatekeeping. There's a lot of gatekeeping. Um, some of these gatekeepers are the most ignorant people that I have ever met. And I'm going to say that one more time. Some of the gatekeepers in a variety of different educational institutions, a variety of different levels, are the most uneducated, ignorant people that I have ever met. And I say this as like, I think, again, somebody who's seen it happen in so many different ways. It doesn't matter if the person is like a Columbia graduate or they are, the person at the DMV trying to like, you know, get your, I don't know, you're trying to get a copy of your ID printed out again, whatever, right? Like it doesn't really matter. These types of gatekeepers make a lot of other, first of all, they're often I say ignorant because they don't really know the bigger picture. They don't see the bigger picture. And they're also not educated on the bigger picture. And it happens in social circles of all kinds. It happens, among some of the wealthiest individuals, and it also happens, with some of the most underprivileged, uh, financially struggling groups of people. Um, and having to confront these sort of different types of gatekeeping is like, in order to go around or through or to like navigate this requires constant code switching, what we call code switching and like pedagogy and language is that you have to like basically do linguistic gymnastics in order to talk to these different types of people differently. And when I say like these are some of the most ignorant people, I'm not talking about like it doesn't matter if the person is again a Columbia graduate or um a nobody, like they don't have any kind of educational background or certificates. Like they're ignorant on a whole other level. Um because the types of code switching and like linguistic code switching and linguistic gymnastics required by some of these BIPOC students in order to start having access to these different like universities and colleges and professional opportunities. I mean, it just it puts so much psychological stress on this particular type of these particular demographics of students. This is why so many advocates oppose like going back on DEI hiring and DEI like diversity based opportunity programs and like funding for colleges and universities um, because when you that's a form of equity. It's not just about equality, it's equity. You really do have to start opening doors for these types of students because they are doing and achieving things that have required them to constantly code switch, to constantly, stereotype bust, to constantly advocate that when you do not do that, you are really like adding insult to injury, for lack of a better word, because they've had to work so much more than, individuals that have had privileged backgrounds. And the financial opportunities versus risk conversation, part of the crisis. A lot of these stereotypes of like, you don't need education to make it big. I'm gonna be honest, like it comes from people that, are afraid of taking the financial risk, that are afraid of like basically investing in themselves. And they think that investing in themselves in this way shouldn't be necessary. Um, I would be concerned with anybody that says that, as a woman, um, because I think the financial investment is always worth it. And the risk is worth it for a lot of individuals that go into like being a doctor or being a lawyer. They know that that kind of risk is worth it. Getting a PhD, even in a humanities degree, is worth it when they're able to access tenure track positions. And that kind of financial reward comes in the sense of like financial security because they're able to have like access to positions that are likely to be opened and secure for much longer and there's less instability. So it's a long game, right? That investment is a long game, not a short game. Um, and I'm going to be again like a kernel of truth here. I'm always concerned that these types of people are just cheap, that they do not want to invest because they themselves are intimidated by the types of individuals that emerge from these educational programs and systems, having overcome so many different types of struggles and having had to stereotype bust, having had to advocate for themselves, having had experience with systemic racism and knowledge, having the having been able to learn how to discern between different types of gatekeeping, learning how to, code switch is a skill in itself. The types of people that are saying these things are generally people that are afraid and intimidated by these types of individuals. So they're either really cheap because they don't want to pay for the type of labor that emerges that isn't going to be brainwashed easily, or they're just, they're either bitter or resentful that the system didn't work for them. Um, or it could just be racism again, right? Um, so again, going back to this idea of mental health, a crisis, you either can emerge from this entire struggle, like restating some of these stereotypes because you are resentful and bitter and are cheap, don't want to invest, and that is a real actual mental health issue that people need to deal with. Or on the other hand, the people that had appropriate help in addressing these problems early on were able to emerge with still a much more resilient, confident and positive outlook that their educational struggles have been worth it. Because this is again the two different types of people that emerge from this sort of like modern educational crisis. Um, and the confrontations between them are a form of like social gaslighting. So there's a lot of gaslighting in society that you're going to have to overcome, and realizes that this is just how it is. When you're a Latina and you're in higher education, you're going to meet a lot of men hiring professionals that are going to confront, like they're going to try to bring you down, um, and lower your confidence and lower your self-esteem, and put you in a position where you feel like you're being questioned and your value is being questioned quite a lot. And this is not just from personal experience. I've had a lot of friends in, at different levels of education that have encountered the same problem. You're, if you are, for example, an educated Latina, um, with an MA, even a BA, an MA, the cultural struggle is going to be different in the sense that these types of cultures, especially like, and I've seen this a lot with Black students as well, the more well educated a woman is in whatever particular field, if they're trying to access opportunities within a culture, or they're trying to access like relational opportunities, um, whatever it is, like what I've noticed is that they tend to have a harder time navigating relationships within their own culture. And this goes back to like this sort of code switching and like different types of burnout. Um, the types of women that emerge, BIPOC women that emerge from these systems that are educated and have access to this type of education, are going to be thinking much differently than the ones that do not have access to this, or have not had access to this. So, and statistically speaking, the more education the woman has, the more challenging it becomes to have a relationship with the average male individual, if we're talking like heteronormative standards within those same cultures. So to give you an example, Latina women in higher education are more likely to struggle having relationships with individuals of their own culture if their own culture is not supportive of higher education. And I'm talking about immediate family members, or even extended family members. They're more likely to not actually make a relational connection or a romantic or sexual connection with these individuals because they are more educated. And not only that, but the psychology and the research tracks that the higher the IQ, of a woman, the less likely they are to engage in relationships with men that have lower IQs. And, so this is something that gets exponentially more complicated when you're a BIPOC student, or you're a BIPOC graduate at whatever educational level. And again, something that I always like to point out, like there's always the crisis of like the confidence versus humility versus like people with really big egos. Um, and this is partly why I say the crisis is psychological and not so much anything else, because confidence doesn't mean lack of humility. Um, some some of the most confident people are incredibly humble, and they will admit that even though they are specialists, maybe you should get a second opinion. Um, and then there are people that are maybe not so well qualified, who are also confident, but their ego has taken over. And, um, they will say like they have the definitive answer for something. If I were to choose between those two people, I would go with the one that has the humility to say maybe you should consult uh, another professional because, you know, and I think this is kind of where a lot of the same problems get circulated over and over again is when students come across the people with the big egos that claim to have the answer or all the answers, and then it comes out to like, you know, for the particular problem that the student has, maybe the person with the big ego didn't have the actual solution. So that is something else to take into consideration. I've seen this so many times, even at like the tutoring level where you have the instructor telling the students one thing and that solution was oversimplified. It wasn't going to work for the student. And so maybe the teaching assistant was able to help that student much better, or the tutor was able to help the student much better. Um, so again, it confidence is not always a lack of humility. Um, and this is again, I'm gonna make this really culturally I'm gonna make a really direct cultural like example. Something that, for example, Latina graduates or Latino graduates struggle with is going back to their immediate family circle or extended circle, um, and realizing that people believe that because they've had this education that they no longer have humility, and it's a different type of gaslighting, right? It's like a lot of us are praised for being educated, having had access to higher education, but at the same time we're put down for being confident. Even though we may be humble, sometimes our confidence is read as lack of humility, and for thinking like, oh, se cree muy muy, or um, yeah, she doesn't want to be part of like the group anymore, or a number of different things, right? There's so many other like cultural stereotypes and labels that get tacked onto these particular types of students and graduates and professionals, if I'm honest. Um, that's a whole other like part of this modern educational crisis. Okay, so again, like I said, I may have to do a different video for more of this, and I may have to like expand on some of these ideas more in the future, but for now this is it. I hope you found this video interesting on the real problem with modern education. What is the real problem? And hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.